Today, you're going to hear from members of our Collections Committee, which comprises board members and docents, and our ace archivist, Anna Schwartz, whose passion for what she has been discovering sparked the idea for this program. We'll be featuring letters, essays, and other documents from Colonel Tim and his son, John Six, and more. And please stay around until the end when you can ask questions of our readers. For this event, Carolyn will be posting a link where you can donate specifically towards our ongoing collections and archiving work. In fact, a former board member has agreed to match all the funds which are raised in the next hour for this very important work. So if you're excited about what you hear today, please help us continue this important work by clicking on the link in the chat and indicating lecture match, and I think Carolyn's written it out, lecture match on your donation. And we gratefully appreciate any additional donations. Our next lecture will be held on March 13th at 1 o'clock, again by Zoom, and will feature Professor Donna Sager, who will be speaking about her new book, The Practical Renaissance. I understand there may even be some mention of Pickering wood and floors involved, so we'll have to wait and see. She's teased me with that. But for now, I want to introduce our board member and chair of the Collections Committee, Charlie Newhall.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you to all of you who are here today. Appreciate that very much, as well as Caroline, who's behind the scenes making this all happen. So thank you for everybody who's putting in time to bring this important talk to you all, and you taking the time to be here. I want to take a moment here and acknowledge that this is a day where many of us are standing in solidarity with those who are in the streets and those who are displaced because of the aggressive actions of Russia and her hyper-nationalist leader. I do not presume to imagine what the Pickerings, to whom we refer to today, might have thought of this moment, but we do know that the war in the Ukraine is not driven by the love of liberty and sovereignty, two virtues the generations of the Pickerings fought to expand. And I ask us now just to take a moment to be in quiet solitude with those virtues of liberty and sovereignty and the people of the Ukraine. May peace come soon with liberty and sovereignty. The Pickering Foundation stewards wonderful cultural artifacts, from the house to the barn to the furniture and objects. In addition, the foundation is a repository of thousands of pages of manuscripts, pamphlets, ephemera, and books. You see some behind Tim and I here in the library. Many of these archives are held on deposit at the Phillips Library of the Peabody Essex Museum, and some have been acquired by the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. A few years ago, the board set out to renew our commitment to take seriously our stewardship of the collections. We began by visiting the Massachusetts Historical Society and having a very informative look at some of the Pickering treasures kept there, guided by Peter Drummy, the MHS librarian. We have yet to take a committee outing to the Phillips Library, but today we welcome Dan Lipkin, the Phillips librarian, who is joining us. Thank you for being here, Dan. At these first-tier historical libraries, the Pickering Papers are made widely available to scholars. The remaining treasure trove at the Pickering House are now being organized, cataloged, and preserved by the efforts of the board, Linda, our wonderful executive director, and the Collections Committee, who are here presenting, mostly by Anna Schwartz, to enter the holdings into the Past Perfect software program, a wonderful program that allows us to be able to see what's there digitally and eventually to make some of those resources available digitally online. We're also storing them in acid-free files for future use, and you'll see a little bit of that toward the end. Today, we just want to give you a sense of the richness of the collection. Each of us have chosen one or two items to highlight, and we're going to bring those to you to the fore by talking about them and perhaps even reading from them. While we are moving more and more toward interpreting the Pickering House itself in the Gothic period, roughly in antebellum 1840s and 1850s, the intellectual sweet spot for the Pickerings is really the Revolution and the early National Republican period, when the house is tied to John Pickering V. I know it sounds rather regal, doesn't it? The fifth. His brother, Colonel Timothy Pickering, and John Pickering VI. Again, the regality continues. Yet they were very much Republicans in the small r Republican sense. To begin our tour, if you will, of the Pickering collection and what we've seen, we're going to start with our inveterate tour guide and docent. Jeff Suarez, for many years, was the voice and presence at the Pickering House when anybody came to the door and had a tour. Jeff has gone on to other things, but has stayed with us at the same time. He is now with the Chamber of Commerce in Salem, but he's also on the board of the Pickering Foundation. So I'd like to turn it to Jeff now to talk a little bit about some documents that you found in the collection that have inspired you, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Let me screen share here. And if anyone at any time, you're noticing that the chat box or the camera boxes along the right-hand side of Zoom, if it's obscuring any of the text, at any time during any of the presentations today, you can actually move that around. You can just click the individual cells and just start sliding them to see what's on the screen if anybody needs to do that. So, so the letter that I chose was a pretty interesting one. I actually have to thank Amanda for originally transcribing and for turning it up. And it was pretty interesting. Whether an unrestrained freedom of the press have a salutary, a beneficial influence on the political and moral state of a country. And the letter itself, the essay really was without a whole lot of context in the collection. It was with a few other essays that we believe were most likely written by John Pickering VI while he was attending Harvard. And you'll notice here, this is an old lithograph, actually, in fact, done by Paul Revere, that's in the collection of Harvard. So I imagine this is probably quite a bit like the campus as John VI would have seen it. He was attending between 1792 and 1796. And at that time, the issue of freedom of press, freedom of speech was a huge one. It was one of the principal issues, you could even say, about really any government at that time, whether it was in England, whether it was in France, of course, with the French Revolution, even here in our own government with the Bill of Rights being implemented, as well as the Democratic Republican response to the Jay Treaty, and George Washington having, of course, worked to approve that. There was quite a lot of outcry in the newspapers against some of these acts that had taken place, including the most radical one at the time was the Alien and Sedition Acts, which in fact allowed the Federalist government at the time, John Adams' administration, to squelch, in a sense, some of the opposition newspapers that were coming out, whether they were truthful or otherwise. It allowed them an opportunity to squelch that information from getting out. And so, of course, when we view it at this lens today, freedom of press is something we hold very, very dear. But as I read the letter, I would ask you, don't just look at it in terms of freedom of the press. Look at it in terms of freedom of information, as well as possibly in the lens of misinformation as well too. And I think it takes a much more modern approach than just this not entirely pro freedom of the press stance that John Pickering obviously outlined. So here it is. Whether an unrestrained freedom of the press have a salutary influence on the political and moral state of a country. Restrictions on the freedom of the press to a certain degree have been generally considered as having a beneficial influence on society. And no one, we think, who reasons impartially upon the subject will go so far as to contend that the press should be subject to no restrictions. In such a case, one man might injure or even destroy the reputation of others without suffering the punishment which his guilt united, and thus an injury to reputation One of the greatest which can happen to a man would be committed with impurity, which would have a tendency to destroy the benefit of living in society, as much as if injuries to property should go unpunished. The freedom of the press then should be under certain restrictions, since if not, it will be abused by those malicious persons who, too pusillanimous to avenge themselves honorably and openly, do ever under of the press wreak their vengeance in a dark and assassin-like manner upon those whose well-deserved and unsullied reputation they are desirous of destroying. Whether restrictions of the press should be imposed previously to the publication is a question which has been much discussed by statesmen. If we may judge by the practice of the European nations in general, we may find them almost without exception to have decided in favor of restrictions previous to publishing. But it is said in those nations, the people do not enjoy liberty, and that this is owing to the want of a free press. It must no doubt be allowed that the liberty of the press is one of the safeguards to the citizen. But yet we find in history examples where the people have asserted their liberty, notwithstanding the restrictions on the press. Of these, we need only mention one instance, which is the most remarkable perhaps of all. We mean the Reformation of Luther, by which there were secured to the people of Europe the most important of all liberties, the liberty of conscience. Yet this was accomplished before the press was made free. We do not mean, however, to say that the press should be under the entire management of licensures, as was the case both before and after the Revolution in England, or that, for that might be the means of depriving men of saying their just sentiments before the public and a few individuals. Might this become the sole judge of what should or should not be exposed to the eyes of the world? The severe restraints imposed when the press was under the control of inspectors had doubtless an evil tendency, considered both with regard to the morals and politics of the people. For when under such restrictions, a few individuals only would be acquainted with the affairs of their own nation and the interests which are so dear to them. But from this, it does not follow that there ought to be no restrictions at all. Because severe restraints are injuries, it does not follow that moderate ones may not be beneficial. Of the wondrous effects which the freedom of the press produce, we shall be fully aware when we observe the great changes which important disclosures and discoveries of truth, which but for this freedom would never have been known cause in the affairs of a nation. Delhomme, an eminent writer on the liberty of the press, has said, so important is the influence which this freedom exercises over a people, that if it could exist in despotic governments, it would form a counterpoise to the power of the prince. If this control is so great, as we have every reason to think that it is, the unrestricted freedom of the press might ruin a nation. If unprincipled men, by falsehood and calamity, should misrepresent the character of its leading men, and disseminate opinions which, however false, would be believed and would stimulate many, who would otherwise be quiet at the news, to seditious and rebellious against the best government. From these views of the subject, it is evident that an unrestrained freedom of the press has not a salutary influence on the moral and political state of a country, but that the press, when restricted in some degree, is indisputably necessary to the happiness of a society. And so that is not the most decidedly pro-First Amendment essay that I was kind of anticipating to find from, the son of John Pickering Colonel Timothy, written by John Pickering VI. But interestingly enough, knowing that it was John Adams and a Federalist administration that ultimately put into place the Alien and Sedition Acts, you can realize that some of these tendencies, they didn't come from nowhere. There was some interesting undercurrents that was flowing, in the Federalist Party. And of course, John Pickering VI, who, being the son of Colonel Tim, obviously followed some of these beliefs. And so the letter was quite interesting and almost a little shocking to me when I first read it. But I think it really takes its most interesting slant when you look at these quotes. Really, the last quote, the one here, the freedom of the press should not be under certain restrictions, since it'll be abused and destroying reputations. And then especially with this quote here, if unprincipled men by falsehood and calamity should misrepresent the character of its leading men, you can stimulate many who would otherwise be quiet at the news to seditious and rebellious against the best government. I think is quite interesting in our modern day and age, with potentially a lot of misinformation being online. I think it takes a really interesting slant. So I hope you folks enjoyed this letter, and I'm excited to hear the rest of them.
Jeff, thank you
Yeah.
very much for finding that letter, reading that letter, and sharing it with us. And I think as an early Americanist, I can tell you that that letter, if it should it be published, should it be out in the domain, is really an interesting letter for people looking at the early National Republic in the 1790s during the time of the Alien Sedition Acts, but particularly looking at it in the context of what was going on with John Adams and his relationship with Tim Pickering. So there's a lot to be said there, and that's just scratching the surface.
Yeah.
John Pickering was an extremely well-educated and well-rounded cosmopolitan figure. And as a cosmopolitan figure, he traveled extensensively in Europe. And we're going to now turn to Anna Schwartz, who's going to tell us a little bit about when he went to a place that's near and dear to her heart, and she'll explain.
All right, here's the slides. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, or should I say in Portuguese, boa tarde a todos, because we're continuing our group talk today in the capital of Portugal, Lisbon, in the footsteps of John Pickering VI. It's dear to my heart because my parents are Portuguese, and I've kept a good relationship with the country and the people who live there, even if now I'm far. Yeah, so 20-year-old John Pickering was hired as the private secretary of the US ambassador, William Lawton Smith. And based on different archival documents or disposition at the foundation, we know that John arrived in Lisbon in August 1797 and lived there until late 1799, about a month, a month of difference, not a lot. So next slide, I'm not ready, sorry. So I'm going to present two letters John received during this time in Portugal. The letters were sent by a certain João Pinheiro Freire da Cunha, one dated from March 3, 1799, and the other from April 7, 1799, so a bit about a month later. Both letters are quite short. They are both in Portuguese, of course, but with some differences of spelling with the modern Portuguese of today. And even for me, being fluent in Portuguese, it was not easy to read at first, and I had some help. I will talk more of this later. Something to add here is that there are just a few traces the Pickering House has of John Pickering corresponding with a Portuguese national. Indeed, besides correspondence he kept with family and friends in the US, most of the documents we have of John Pickering in Portugal consist mainly of memoranda about an incredible variety of subjects from Portugal. Production, the weather in Portugal or in Lisbon, commerce. So this activity of collecting, researching, observing, and this interest of the language, the Portuguese language, shows the impact this period had in the genesis of John Pickering, the linguist. And that is precisely why I chose to present those two letters, because what I found about the sender, João Pinheiro Freire da Cunha, bring new hypotheses, elements about John Pickering years in Portugal. So let's get to the two letters now. So as I said earlier, these letters are in Portuguese, written by João Pinheiro Freire da Cunha to John Pickering. So I will read both translations to you, and then I will provide like a quick general analysis at the end. There's not a lot we can take without some context, and then after this, I will give the context. So next slide. So for people who have notions of Spanish, Italian, or Latin, you might just be fine just with the slides. All right, so Your Excellency the Secretary, I told your Lordship of my cold, which was still making itself known when I spoke to you, Then, being most indisposed, it has made it difficult for me to come to your presence. And as for the gentlemen, they have only 3 tickets left, which I will be able to fulfill to your lordship, for as they never made any use of the lessons. It remains the same to them, plus or minus 3, besides which I saw 3 times I went there at the appointed time, and they were not at home. I beg your lordship to do me the favor of asking His Excellency to deign to excuse me for this week, because I will go tomorrow and 8 days without fail. Here is the 5th page, and I will bring the chosen collection. I wish your lordship all the best, and may you never remove me from the role of your servants, because I am to your lordship very reverent, obliged, and humble servant, João Pinheiro Freire da Cunha. So let's pass to the next letter very quickly, a shorter one here. So same opening, Your Excellency the Secretary. I have been even weaker for 3 days due to the health problems I was experiencing. However, tomorrow and Tuesday, I will be reducing the tickets to His Excellency. The impossible cannot be remedied, and because some remain, when His Excellency returns, I will finish them, God willing. So same complimentary closing. So when I came across these letters for the first time, it was very intriguing. There were a lot of unclear passage, of course, because of the lack of context. And there were like those tickets he's talking about in the 2 letters. Where are these men? He talked about in the first one. But one question remained on top of the list. Who was this João Pinheiro Freire da Cunha? In the greetings, Your Excellency the Secretary, we see right away that there is a formality in the relationship between the 2 men. They probably have a professional relationship. So I first tried to find a mention of him in the papers linked to John's life in Portugal. There was nothing about him in the correspondences John was keeping from America, or at least not in the ones we already knew about, or we already inventoried. So I finally found him mentioned while consulting John Pickering's biography. I completely forgot about it. So Life of John Pickering, written by his daughter, Mary Ornport Pickering. So Mary compiled a selection of John's correspondence to illustrate the biography. And I found Pinheiro's name in a letter, or I should say a footnote of a letter here. And it was a letter we had not yet came across or inventoried. So I will read you the citation very quickly. So it's a letter to his father, Colonel Timothy Pickering, from December 6, 1797. I have a Portuguese master, of whom I have taken already 24 lessons. That is, I have studied the language 24 hours and can speak it with tolerable ease. What a wonderful progress. And then you see the footnote. Pinheiro was his teacher of Portuguese. So now thinking back to the letters, like we see lessons, 5th page, John Pickering was a private teacher of Portuguese. But without coming across these 2 letters in Portuguese, it would have been very difficult to link Pinheiro with the letter John sent to his father and identified him as John's Portuguese teacher. And John does not mention him anywhere. It doesn't mention his name in the letter, and the footnote does not even mention Pinheiro's full name. And he had a big one. But I decided to dig more, and thanks to the wonder of internet and a very fortunate contact I made from Portugal, I found out that João Pinheiro Freire da Cunha was much more than a private teacher of Portuguese. So here we go. Pinheiro Freire da Cunha is known today as a Portuguese grammarian and philologist, whose work was instrumental in the evolution of the teaching of Portuguese and the development of Portuguese orthography and grammar. He published several books and pamphlets, and most importantly, founded in 1772 the Academia Ortográfica Portuguesa, the Portuguese Orthographic Academy, instrumental at a time where there was tremendous change in the way Portuguese was taught in the Empire of Portugal. So although it was first open to Portuguese members, and Pinheiro's Academy expanded so well that it started to welcome foreign members wishing to learn Portuguese. And this was the case starting years before John's time in Lisbon. In his memoirs, Pinheiro claims that by 1802, there were already more than 6,000 members who benefited from his academia. From the 6,000 members, only one member is known today from the historical sources. I believe it's an Irish linguist. The question is here, one of them actually. So is John Pickering one of the plus 6,000 members of the Academia Ortográfica Portuguesa? We have many reasons to think it could be the case. And if it is, it shows that John Pickering was already involved, or at least in contact with linguists, circles of linguists, and more importantly, in other countries as early as 20 years old, when he was 20 years old. So, obrigada pela sua atenção. Thank you for your attention. And I also wanted to personally thank Professor Rolf Kemmler from the Universidade of Trás-os-Montes e Alto Douro. Thank you so much for your help and also for sharing your book with me. His work really showed the importance of João Pinheiro Freire da Cunha in the Portuguese language, and I wouldn't have been able to know it without you. Thank you so much.
Anna, thank you so much for your insight. You came as a archivist for us and have done tremendous work with Past Perfect and organizing things. We'll see a little bit more an example of that coming up. But you're a scholar as well, and your passion for bringing his linguistic curiosity to the fore through these letters is really terrific.
Yeah.
Clearly, John Pickering had this incredibly fascinating mind and was so interested in language. But I think in part, his language and his interest came in part from his father, who was also deeply curious and smart man. And to turn to think a little bit about his father, we have Tim Jenkins, who many of you I'm sure know, lives in the Pickering House because he happens to be married to the executive director. He's also a board member and a dear friend. So I give you
Thanks, Charlie.
Tim Jenkins.
Wow. Thank you, Charlie. And thank you, Anna, for teeing me up. I do want to thank, in particular, another board member who brought this particular letter that I'm going to read you after a little bit of introductory information. I'd like to thank Catherine Pickering, because this is when I really found myself absolutely enamored of Timothy Pickering. And this is when she shared a letter that Timothy Pickering had written on the 21st of March, 1792 to George Washington, just at the beginning of what would become an almost decade-long career in the executive branch of our fledgling government. He'd started off actually living in Pennsylvania and really actively working for the state of Pennsylvania in an area that near what we now call Wilkesboro. And it was an area where there had been a terrible during the both during the Revolution there and afterwards, there had been a fairly significant pogrom, if you will, a major event that it wiped out a large number of white settlers in the area. And this would become an ongoing issue for the United States as our population moved west into Indian territory. So Catherine read this letter to us at a board meeting, and I was literally stunned. I just couldn't even get back to the meeting. And I'd like to, before I do this, because many of you may not know that much about Tim's career, but try to read you a little bit of a biographical description that comes on page 495 of volume 3 of the Life of Timothy Pickering. In this case, this volume was written by Charles Upham. And it begins as follows. When Colonel Pickering left his office on the evening of the 12th of May, 1800, he had been for 9 years in various branches of the administration of the United States as an Indian negotiator, postmaster general, secretary of war, secretary of state, and had discharged the functions of or been connected with each and all of the then existing departments and performed services now distributed through the entire organization of the executive force of our government. As Postmaster General, he was the head of a bureau in the Treasury. As Secretary of War, he was in charge of the Navy as well as the Army, and also superintended Indian affairs and the policy of the country. As Secretary of State, he not only conducted the intercourse with other nations, but all businesses relating to the territories, to patents, the mint, and the census. He had, in fact, at different times under his guiding hand, the whole machinery of the government. The state papers show the ability, industry, and fidelity of his service, more various and extensive in its range than any other one man had ever been called to discharge. Throughout, he met the approval of Washington. In his last office, particularly, was this the case, his last office being Secretary of State. All of his compeers, Jay, Marshall, Ames, Hamilton, King, Cabot, and others, bore cordial and grateful testimony to the value of his labors. James Madison succeeded Colonel Pickering with a brief interval as Secretary of State. After the conclusion of Madison's most distinguished political life, during which he and Pickering had been opponents, he declared to friends and visitors that the records of the State Department gave evidence of ability on Colonel Pickering's part never surpassed. No man was ever more competent to pass a judgment on this point than Madison, and his judgment will stand the test of the strictest scrutiny of the documents to which it relates. And on that note, Madison is also famed for describing Tim Pickering as, and I consider it somewhat of a backhanded compliment, the most honest man I have ever known. And that's a talent that one does not meet too often in life. The most talented man I've ever known. So on that note, I'd like to just begin by introducing a few players that will play a role in this letter. Otherwise, like you, the very first time, you'll have to wonder, well, who was that and who's he talking about? One of them is a gentleman named Brant. Brant is his Anglo name of a Mohawk chief, and he was the Mohawks, as well as 3 other of the 6 nations that we more familiarly call the Iroquois. Brant was a leader during the Revolution of a tribe that basically sided with the British. They tried to remain neutral, but ultimately sided with the Brits. So Brant was familiar with the Americans during the Revolution as a leader of the opposition. So he's one player that you should know about. The Town Destroyer is another name that will come up in this letter, and it'll make sense at the time, but I will mispronounce it, but I always call it Kanakatorus, like some giant dinosaur. Tanakatorius, the Town Destroyer, is actually the Native American name for George Washington. He uses the name as early as 1755 in correspondence, interestingly enough, with a translator, a Native American translator describing himself. And lore, family lore and whatnot, goes back to his great grandfather as potentially having executed a massacre during a peace negotiation amongst 3 of the neighboring tribes that lived along the expanse of the Potomac and the Susquehanna rivers. So there isn't hard proof on that, but the bottom line is he goes on to earn that title again during the Revolution on his own right, as he gives orders in what's come to be known as Sullivan and Clinton's expedition, in which he gives orders starting in June and the campaign runs through October to completely destroy any Native American village that you encounter. That meant, and he was quite specific, burn the buildings, burn the crops, make it uninhabitable, make sure the crops cannot be regrown. Essentially, it sounds a bit like a genocide. And that is in response to the earlier event I was describing, where a similar event occurred in outside in Wyoming, Pennsylvania, what's now Wyoming, Wilkesboro, Pennsylvania. And then the last name that I'd like to share with you is Conasanti, which is actually the name that the Iroquois, the 5 or 6 nations, gave to Timothy Pickering after negotiating with him, almost the very first event that he ever handled on behalf of Washington, the first negotiations. And it means simply the sunny side of a hill. Quite different from Washington's name amongst Native Americans, the town destroyer. So if I can, I'll read you this letter. I apologize. I've thought about trying to edit it, but Tim Pickering is verbose. I've been accused of the same, I'm afraid, but I think it's worth it to hear the whole letter. And I hope that's enough explanation that each of the points will ring with you. And if you will, on the left, I should also thank you, Carolyn, David Ferrario, who is our national archivist, or the archivist of the United States, who grew up in Beverly, and he very kindly delivered to us when he gave us a talk the beautiful copy of the charter that was completed and called the Canandaigua Treaty, signed by, you'll see 62 red marks, and then 1 mark on the very top, the largest one for Tim Pickering, but all the rest are the sachems and chiefs of the 5 or 6 nations. They were originally known as the 5 Nations, but the Tuscarora joined, were invited into the 5 Nations by the Oneida. Anyway, that's the actual treaty. And thank you, David, for delivering that to us. And the other is a painting showing the huge collection when the Native Americans showed up to the Treaty Council, if you will. There were over 600 people that came with their families, their children, and they were, and I think this is a great little description, and overwhelmed a small town in New York State. So here's the letter that I'm going to read to you. This is the very first, this is very early on in his career as representing the United States and negotiating with the Iroquois. And he's invited the chiefs to Philadelphia, which is at that time the capital of the United States, to offer them the goodwill of the United States and various technologies to help them prosper. So it begins, to George Washington, Philadelphia, Wednesday evening, March 21st, 1792. The manner in which I have been employed to effect the present visit of the chiefs of the 5 nations renders me peculiarly interested that the negotiations with them should conform with the direct object of the invitation. This object is indelibly impressed on my mind, it having been the main argument offered by me to convince them of the real friendship of the United States. I feel interested in its accomplishment because it involves the good faith of the United States. For agreeably to my instructions, quote, I informed them how desirous you were that the Indians should have imparted to them the blessings of husbandry and the arts, quote. And I repeated to them your words, quote, that the United States will be true and faithful to their engagements, quote. Having assured them of the assistance of the United States to introduce among them the knowledge of husbandry and a few other important arts connected with it, I invited a small number of the principal chiefs to come to Philadelphia after the last corn harvest to negotiate the plan for their introduction. That visit, too, independently of its principal object, might make useful impressions. They delayed coming. The destructive defeat of our army took place. This sad event might prevent their coming. Good policy dictated a fresh invitation, and then it might not seem to flow from fear or discouragement. I thought the renewal of the invitation should appear to proceed wholly from me. The idea was liked by General Knox. I wrote a message to be sent by Mr. Kirkland. As I recollect, the general informed me that it was approved by you. In the message, I reminded them of my former invitation to come to the great council fire of the United States in order to fix the time and manner of introducing among them the knowledge of farming, of smiths and carpenters' work, of spinning and weaving, and of reading and writing. These being the arts I had before expressly mentioned. I added that, quote, that I was impatient for their arrival, that they might receive strong proofs that the words I spoke to them were true, that they came from my heart, and that the United States are faithful to their engagements. The invitation was confined to this single object. Permit me, therefore, to express my opinion that until the entire arrangement relative to it be formed to their full satisfaction, no other object should be brought into view. But this being adjusted with such strong proofs before them of the candor, the truth, the justice, and the liberality of the United States, they will be convinced that we really are their friends. And thus they may be led to entertain a belief that we are heartily disposed to be friends and of the other tribes now in arms against us. And impressed with this belief, they may listen to the overtures to become mediators between us. But if the latter be proposed in the first instance, the natural order of things will be reversed, and I fear every object of their visit defeated. If the Secretary of War had asked me a single question on the subject, I should freely have suggested to him these ideas. This evening, I chanced to hear that doubtless, not adverting to the terms of the invitation, is preparing a speech to be delivered tomorrow in which the disposition of the five nations to become mediators is to be sounded. I have therefore thought it my duty, without loss of time, to submit to them to your consideration. I have no desire to appear in the matter, having nothing in view but to prevent a serious mischief. There is an additional reason for the caution here suggested, which I beg leave to mention now. Last Thursday, when the Indians gave me their formal answers to my invitation, they stated many causes of their delay. Among other things, they told me that Brant had been the means of detaining them. Quote, Brant, said they, who knows as much as white people know, told us that the real design of the invitation was not on the paper, but behind it. That is, the avowed object of the invitation was merely ostensible, while the real object was kept out of sight. There is another reason which I ought not to conceal. Indians have been so often deceived by white people. The white man is among many of them, but another name for liar. Really, sir, I am unwilling to be subjected to this infamy. I confess I am not indifferent to a good name, even among Indians. Besides, they received and expressly considered me as, quote, your representative, end quote, and my promises as the promises of, quote, the town destroyer, end quote. Sir, for your honor and the honor and interest of the United States, I wish them to know that there are some white men who are incapable of deceiving. I acknowledge, sir, that my feelings have been excited, and I have expressed myself in a style unusual in addressing you. I trust you will ascribe to it the true cause, the interesting situation in which I stand. With great respect, I am, sir, your most humble and obedient servant.
Tim,
Charlie's
Tim, thank you very much. There's a lot in that incredible letter, and you know, to have a Washington Tim Pickering to George Washington letter is quite remarkable.
Yeah.
And as we think about deceiving leaders and think about the issue of sovereignty, they're very much at the forefront of what's going on here in the Pickering collection.
Yes, it does seem to be a very timely letter.
Indeed. From that, we're going to turn to Otis Edwards. Otis is a neighbor, but he also is a board member of the Pickering Foundation. And as a relatively recent board member, we've benefited quite a bit from Otis's participation because he brings a keen eye to his understanding of Native stories. He actually is a PhD student at the University of Hong Kong, looking at the East India trade and business practices. But he's, again, honed his skills on John Pickering's, orthography. And we turn to him to hear about that. Our good friend, Otis Edwards.
Thank you. Let's see, I'm looking for my, there we go. I think that's right. Is that coming up? Good. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you, Charlie, for that introduction. It's very kind. My talk today regards the books that are relating to native languages in the Pickering House collections. I start obviously with John Pickering. Briefly, he was born in Salem in 1777, graduated in Harvard 1796, studying classical languages. After graduation, he went back to Philadelphia to work in a law office and began studying native languages sometime around 1817. So in a lot of ways, my talk really picks up where Anna's left off after he returns from Portugal, which has some really interesting connections. What I found in exploring the native language collections at the Pickering House has led me to see John Pickering as an exacting scholar, but also as someone who held progressive thoughts and ideas about race and equality that were often at odds with the general public and with the scholars in his field. I think the roots of his interest really started picking up where Tim left off with his father in his father's efforts, Timothy Pickering, in Pennsylvania. In 1790, George Washington had appointed Timothy Pickering as the Indian Commissioner or Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And in the fall, he and his family had arrived in the Wyoming Valley. John Pickering at that time was 13 years old. And while in Pennsylvania, he witnessed firsthand the contested land grievances between frontier whites and native peoples, who are often referred to as savages and barbarians. Because he met principal chiefs like Farmer's Brother and the eloquent Red Jacket, he knew that those ideas simply didn't apply. He saw native peoples as peaceable, family-oriented, and fair. He also observed newly arriving frontiers people and settlers as commoners who were escaping harsh conditions abroad. They were seeking a better life, but were often themselves victims hoodwinked by land surveyors into purchasing properties that weren't theirs to sell. John Pickering was able to form his opinions on these experiences before he went to Harvard. And after his graduation in 1796, Pickering began the study of law in Philadelphia in the office of Edward Tillman, whose court cases tested the legality of claims on Indian lands. While working in the law office in Philadelphia, he meets Peter Stephen Duponceau, who was also involved in handling land speculation issues. I discovered Duponceau was himself a rather interesting character, and I could see why John Pickering would be drawn to his broad interests. He, like Pickering, also studied languages formally before migrating to the United States to fight in the Revolutionary War. Duponceau joined the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia in 1791. He became notable in linguistics for his analysis of the indigenous languages of the Americas. As a member of the Society's Historical and Literary Committee, he helped build a collection of texts and described and recorded native languages. While in Philadelphia, John Pickering also published a book on language, a vocabulary or a collection of words and phrases which have supposed to be peculiar to the US. That was in 1861. I assume that's after he returned from Portugal. Sometime after 1816, Duponceau and Pickering began work on updating a grammar of the Massachusetts Indian language, originally written by John Eliot in 1666, to be republished by the Massachusetts Historical Society. Pickering is the editor, and Duponceau provides comments, especially in his own investigations of the Delaware language. Pickering's role as editor is to update the scholarship on Massachusetts native language from what Eliot wrote 156 years earlier. For the scholarship to be relevant, Pickering needed to initiate conversations with Christian missionaries who were sent to work with Native American peoples. Missionaries had been encouraged to compile native language dictionaries and some common forms of grammar. Many of the books published by American Christian missions, which John Pickering collaborated on, are cataloged and can be found in the Pickering House collections today. Pickering's notebooks are also in the Pickering House collection. They provide some background to his work on this revision and insight into his character and perspectives. I'll illustrate one of them here today with the to be construct. What's relevant in this construction and fascinating to me in 2022 is this is an existential construct of individual human awareness and one's place in the world. And there was a lot at stake in answering this question. For example, if natives don't have an understanding of their own individual agency, then how can they be relied upon to answer and sign binding treaties with civilized races? On this page, Pickering examines his correspondence with the Reverend Mr. Buttrick quite thoroughly. In this case, it's through this analyzing the idea of this construct to be. Here's the final entry in the printed book. Pickering is adding to the scholarship which John Eliot began in 1666 and concluded that native languages didn't account for this construct. But Pickering contests this notion. It reads, quote, in conformity to what has been observed in modern times, and then goes on to reference the names of missionaries who have reported their findings on this to be construct in differing native languages. In Pickering's updated version, all native languages permit native peoples to speak and think from an individual perspective, in other words, to have human agency, just as in English or any European language. Pickering was content to excuse Eliot's understanding of language as it dated from 1666, and Eliot was clearly no modern scholar of language. But Pickering was less flexible with what he felt were current in the 1820s transgressions imposed upon native peoples by stereotyping their language as simple and crude. William van Humboldt was an adept linguist and was affiliated with the Berlin Academy of Sciences, but was also a non-resident member of the American Philosophical Society in 1822. In the appendix to the Grammar of Massachusetts Indian Language, Pickering wrote, quote, a vague idea still prevails that idioms of barbarous tribes must be greatly inferior to those of civilized nations, and to show that their organization is comparatively imperfect. Thus, Baron Wilhelm von Humboldt assigned them to an inferior rank in the scales of languages. Humboldt's hypothesis of linguistic determinism is a principle suggesting that the structure of language affects its speaker's worldview and cognition, and thus people's perceptions are relative to the spoken language. To me, Pickering likely thought this smelled a lot like what he had disapproved of in the to-be construction. But rather than simply rely on that evidence, he makes sure he's applying Humboldt's ideas specifically. Humboldt had this idea of agglutination, or essentially just compounding words. And you can find that Pickering's thorough and methodical testing of Humboldt's hypothesis in his notebooks. Here are some other examples from Pickering's notebook where he was working out these grammatical constructions. For example, he's working through active and passive voice, conjunctions, and modes of speech that are indicative or imperative or subjugative or infinitives. It's interesting to me to see how careful he is to detail his correspondence with missionary collaborators. In the footnotes to these pages, which admittedly they're hard to see, you can see his references such as Mr. Bodinet says here, and Mr. B thinks this should be XXX, or Mr. Buttrick not sufficiently investigated this. In these notebooks, it's clear he's both collecting data from missionaries, but also synthesizing their meanings. He had been reading current scholarship in the field of linguistics and was aware that theories like Humboldt's were dangerously like Eliot's, only now masquerading as settled science. Pickering's findings are published in the appendix, boldly outlining Humboldt's hypothesis and point by point providing examples of how they don't hold up in the case of Native American languages. Pickering demonstrated that native languages, and therefore native peoples, were just as creative, intelligent, and adaptable as civilized nations. In my conclusions, I saw that Pickering had a visceral belief that Native Americans were inherently equal to civilized peoples. He was witness to the inequities of land speculation at a young age and through his work in the Philadelphia Law Office. Once he studied languages formally at Harvard, he contested old notions of Native peoples as savages and worked to demonstrate their equality to civilized people through analysis of their languages. He also came to see some academics could assign rank to language based on flawed understanding of the topic. Thus, John Pickering was also an advocate for racial equality towards international academic audience as well. His notebooks and the Pickering collections bear witness to his efforts. Thank you.
Otis, that was absolutely terrific. A tour de force into Timothy Pickering's thinking about language and race. And John Pickering, John Pickering, that Tim's here keeping me honest. John Pickering, thinking about language and race and culture, and to see his working through the verb to be, and that's just really terrific. I just quickly, Tim has pulled out a document here that relates to it that we're just going to take a moment to show.
I'm afraid without attribution, but this is a small painting. I have been told, and I cannot find the actual, this is a problem, but I believe it's accurate to say this is a self-portrait of von Humboldt that he sent to John. And it's in our little collection box. And I'm afraid I can't find the linkage, but I know I've heard this, and Jeff maybe can weigh in on this.
And this is exactly why, why we're doing what we're doing, why we're doing this project. It's to bring these kind of materials to scholars to look at. In many ways, what you're doing, Otis, is getting us thinking about them and then making them available, and then also to look at what we actually have here as other resources that in some ways seem to be scattered about the house, but we're making them much more organized. And the person who actually got us going with that professionally was Amanda Eady. And Amanda was, I say, the first person to sit down and begin to catalog things, putting them originally in an Excel spreadsheet and looking through and organizing those papers. Those are the papers that, again, Anna Schwartz has taken to Past Perfect. But Amanda is with us to talk about some of the treasures that she found. And again, she's the person who really got this going professionally. So we're delighted. I'm delighted to have you here, Amanda. Would you tell us a little bit about what you found?
Sure. Hello, I'm Amanda Eddy. So I've actually been the docent at the Pickering House for the last couple of years as well. Unfortunately, 2021 was my last season as I am relocating to the Midwest. But my time at the Pickering House has been so special to me, and I have loved the work I've done and those I have worked with. And I hope I can continue my involvement, even from the Rocky Mountains. And thank you so much to Linda and Tim for giving me this opportunity back in 2020. You both have become family to me, and I'll miss you guys in the Pickering House a lot. But with that being said, so this is a letter by John Pickering VI, who over my time in the archives, on all my tours, I tell everybody he is the historical love of my life. He was an incredible writer, linguist, and he wore many, many other hats. But most important to this letter, he was a philosopher. So with that, the title is Of Living in a New and Growing Country, How Must a Country Settled as Ours Acquire Stability? When we contrast the advantages of living in a new and growing country with the disadvantages that necessarily attend a residence in an old country, and one which is overburdened with its numerous population, we feel more sensibly than ever our good fortune in the enjoyment of a country like our own. One benefit is that a new country makes constant advances in the arts and sciences. Men are stimulated to activity and exertion, and consequently, great improvements are continually making in everything relating to the comforts of society. On the other hand, in old countries, the decline and ruin which we see fill the mind with unpleasant reflections and create an indifference which it is difficult to shake off. It is considered a great advantage in any country that there should be the smallest possible number of poor and suffering persons. And in our own country, we have the example of a people among whom there are very few of these descriptions, for almost all enjoy at least all the necessities of life. In the opinion of unity on this subject, this has been occasioned in part by the original cheapness of land from suspension of commerce in the Revolutionary War, and partly in consequence of the agricultural genius of the inhabitants, which has given us a larger number of landholders than most other countries. The plainness and simplicity of the people arise in a great measure from the local situation of the country, its great distance from the vice and corruption of the old world, and the difficulty of introducing foreign luxuries and vices, lessen the number of imaginary wants, produces independence of circumstances and consequently of mind. If it should be asked how a country settled as ours can acquire stability, it may be answered by checking vice as much as possible, watching carefully the conduct of its leading men, and always endeavoring to have high stations filled by persons of strident integrity and virtue. It is indeed difficult to predict whether a government, based upon such principles as ours is, will have a favorable or unfavorable issue. How far the stability of a country depends on the form of its government is not, in the opinion of eminent statesmen, satisfactorily ascertained. But whatever may be the form of government, whether a republic or a monarchy, there can be no doubt that this, as well as every other government, must acquire stability by refusing admittance to every species of corruption, by cherishing principles of virtue, by discountenancing the wicked and holding out every encouragement to the virtuous. So that's the end of the letter. But just to follow up, so the first time I read this letter, I immediately thought of the lyrics from the musical Hamilton. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that musical. When Hamilton says to Aaron Burr, again, song lyrics, Burr, we studied and we fought and we killed for the notion of a nation we now get to build. And I feel like John 6 really captures the essence of the building of the nation in special regards to its people and values, which are integrity and virtue. He even sort of says, it's hard to tell whether a government structure will be favorable or unfavorable, but regardless that we must reject corruption. A lot of what John wrote reflects similarities of today's political climate and the state of our great nation. We are still fighting to build the country we all love and who men and women, such as the Pickering family, fought for equality and justice for all. So thank you guys for letting me read this letter.
Amanda, thank you very much. That's absolutely terrific. And we will miss you as you move to the Midwest. And we're glad that you take John Pickering with you, not only his virtue and his love of virtue and integrity, but also in your heart. Clearly, and that's wonderful. I want to say to everybody who's stuck with us, and that's virtually all of you, terrific. We are coming toward the end here. I want to say a few words about some of the books in the collection, and then we'll open this up for some questions that people may have. If you have questions that you'd like to frame and put in the chat now, you're welcome to do that. And then we can go from there. But before we do that, I'd just like to say a few words. We're in the library here, and as you can see, there are quite a few books in the background. The books, Tim is going to hold it up and show you. The books in the Pickering collection.
Well, and there are more.
There are more. Are really rich, and you've heard about some of them from Otis, as well as the manuscripts. And I'm going to pull out two of them to talk about. But I also want to show you what we've been doing in a physical way. One thing we've been doing is gathering the papers together and putting them in boxes. So these acid-free storage boxes are really terrific, and we have organized all the papers into file folders. And in each box, you can see we're creating inventories. We have them all obviously on Past Perfect as well, but you can see how things are organized in this particular box. And there are file folders for each of these acid-free file folders that are well organized. And really, this is a tremendous amount of work, and we are being very careful about it, using the best archival practices to do this. This is something that I'm sure that we know the Massachusetts Historical Society has done with the Pickering Papers, and I'm sure the Phillips Library also has them in this case, but now we have them here. So one of the things about doing this is it's a lot of work, and it costs a lot of money, but it's also a way to investigate and find new things. And I want to share one thing that I found. One thing that I found were actually, with the help of Anna, was a collection of letters, and I'm going to show them to you here. Right, there's just the letters. I'm not putting them on a PowerPoint slide, but there they are. And these are letters that struck me as interesting because they're written by Isaac Newhall. So, and Isaac Newhall was somebody I didn't know much about. He turns out to be a dry goods store owner here in Salem. And in 1831, he was interested in a kind of historical question about republic and about liberty and about sovereignty. And in particular, a collection of letters that had been written by somebody else in 1768 to 1771, called the Junius Letters. These Junius Letters were very famous. They had been, they're sort of the lightning rod liberty advocate letters, attacking the king and attacking a lot of the sort of, you might say, conservative Whigs rather than the radical Whigs. And the question was, who had written them? They clearly were an incubator of the American Revolution. And people like John Wilkes was a big advocate of those letters. And John Wilkes, we heard mention of him earlier today when Tim mentioned Wilkes-Barre, and Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, of course, is named for John Wilkes, the famous radical Whig from the 1760s in London, and Isaac Barry, the American French and Indian War veteran who was a member of Parliament and voted very much with the Americans. So these guys were whipping up this revolutionary fervor in the 1760s, and this other person, Junius, wrote a bunch of letters about that, published in a paper, and they became cause célèbre, and they actually brought down one of the governments. They attacked the king, and the question was, who wrote them? And this gentleman here in Salem, inspired in part, I think, by his own reading, ventured into for trying to figure out who wrote the Junius Letters. And he puts forward a potential person to have written it named Grenville. And he says Richard Grenville Temple he thinks is the author of those letters. Richard Grenville Temple actually is the brother-in-law of William Pitt. So this sort of takes us into the weeds of British politics during this period. And his argument, he pens out in letters. These are what we have here in our folders, in letters to John Pickering. John Pickering is interested in this engagement, and it helps Isaac Newhall to actually publish the letters in Boston. Hiram Tupper in early 1830s has the 32 letters published with an introduction by John Pickering. So you can see all this fervor that we have the primary source letters, we have connections back to the Republic, connections back to the 1760s and debates. And that's just one of the collections that are in our archive, but they also point to the books. And the reason I want to point out the books is I want to show you this one here. This is Horace. So Horace would have been a classic that would have been read by John Pickering when he was preparing for Harvard. And in fact, we have from Mary Orne Pickering's biography, we have an account of what John Pickering was actually reading to prepare to go to Harvard. And this was one of the books that he would have read. This is actually not the actual copy. This one was from 1809. But what I found particularly interesting about it is not only is it an interesting copy, but it was translated from the Latin by Philip Francis. So that's interesting because, in fact, scholars now believe that the person who actually wrote the Junius letters was Philip Francis's son. So there's sort of interesting little stories you can pick apart here, looking at the classicism and neoclassicism kind of education they had and how that followed through all the way into the 1830s. I want to show you one final book and then open it up to questions. This is my favorite book in the collection. And this book is, and I'll show you the title page, Letters to a Student at the University of Cambridge, Massachusetts, by John Clark. Well, this is was a well-known tract for preparing students for Harvard in the 1800s, early 1800s. But it was originally written as a series of letters to none other than John Pickering. And John Clark, it turns out, is one of John Pickering's relatives. He's a cousin. And what I like about this copy is this. And I'll read it to you. It says, John Pickering, Jr., 1796, the gift of the Reverend author. And then it says on the other side, bequeathed to Mary O. Orne Pickering, 1845, by her father. Presented to her nephew, John Pickering, Jr., by Mary O. Pickering, Salem, December 25, 1878. And it also says bound in London, 1800. So this book has traveled. And not only was it printed here in Boston by none other than Samuel Hall, who was the first printer in Salem, who later moved back to Boston, it was printed in Boston, on Cornhill, but then becomes the property of John Pickering from the author. He gives it to his daughter, who then gives it to her nephew, and it remains here in the house. So the provenance of this book is exactly that. And I think this book ought to have a phase box for it and be kept very carefully by the Pickering family, because it has that connection, and it has a tremendous connection to that whole history that we've been hearing about today. So I want to thank everybody who's presented, and I want to thank all of you who have been listening attentively and see if you have any questions or comments. And I hope that you are inspired to come back to the Pickering House and have another tour if you haven't had one in recent years, and also to see what we've been doing with the archives and the collections. And we would love to have your support for them beyond coming today. we're looking to raise money to continue this project and get these papers in the shape they need to be in. So scholars, like each of the members of our committee, and other scholars more widely can use them. So with that said, I will turn it back to Linda and see if there are any questions or any comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. And thank you, everybody. This has been, we've talked about this program for a long time, and it's just been fantastic. And I hope everybody's enjoyed it. We do have a few questions, two very similar, so I'll read them together. We'll start with this. Someone asks, can someone speak about how you are digitizing your collection in-house, what the cost is and the number of documents? So I wish we knew that. Endless. Also curious to know if digitized documents will be freely or readily available to the public, and if so, through what site?
I think I can take that, or at least get us started. And Anna, if you'd like to chime in, that'd be fine too. We are making a concerted effort to organize and catalog everything we have first. So the first step is to do that. We have taken some scans of some of the documents and have attached those to our Past Perfect. This is the software program we're using, records, but we're also very much just in the process of seeing what we have. We have anecdotal sense of what we have, but with this project, which is costing in the thousands of dollars so far, and will clearly go into the tens of thousands of dollars. I can't give you an exact figure because we just don't know how long it's going to take. But it is in the tens of thousands of dollars to do this. Once we have a sense of what's there, we'll be then making strategic decisions based on the documents and our bandwidth. What makes the most sense for the Pickering Foundation to make these available? As I mentioned, there are documents at the Massachusetts Historical Society and the Phillips Library. There are actually other repositories of Pickering papers. And we imagine these will at some point be available in a digital way. How that looks right now, we only can imagine because we're taking it step by step.
Thanks, Charlie. I think this one's probably for you too. Someone asks, have you found anything in your collections relating to the impeachment of Judge John Pickering in New Hampshire by the Jeffersonian Democrats?
Anna or Amanda, I don't know if either of you have. That was quite an affair. The very first person who was impeached in the new United States of America, and some say it was slander. He was impeached for being a bit of a drunk on the stand. But whether that's true or whether that was his political rivals trying to pin that on him is a debate among some historians. But I don't know that we have any documentation about that. Amanda or Anna Schwartz, have you seen anything related to the impeachment of Judge Pickering in New Hampshire?
Not yet.
No. And I would also, adding to the first in the Pickering family, I think the first person to be censured by the Senate.
That's right.
Was Timothy.
That's right.
So.
So one thing that we are cognizant of is, as the Pickering Foundation, our responsibility and stewardship is to make these things available, and is not to aggrandize or condemn. But as archivists, we want to make these materials available. So the censure of Tim Pickering is something that we're open to. We're not, as if you went back to Jeff's letter, which it has a mixed take, as Jeff said, on the freedom of the press. So be it. Let's open that up.
Yeah.
Great. Before we close, I do want to say thank you to Carolyn. We're going to lose her because she has to go and do the 5 o'clock Hamilton Hall lecture. So she's going to be on Zoom tonight. But thanks so much, Carolyn, as always. I think between Charlie and I, we can figure out how to end this, or we'll be here next month when you sign on.
You're welcome.
Okay. Someone's asked for a donation link before we end. So maybe that could be your last official act, Carolyn, to put that donation link up again. It's in the chat box. And The last question, thank you. The last question I have here is back to John Pickering and Salem. Have we found any information that the connection between John Pickering and Salem and the John Pickering in New Hampshire? Of course, which John Pickering in Salem? That's there were 11 of them.
Well, they're again, I'm not a scholar or historian, but they are two separate branches of the family, I believe. And the branch that I'm aware of also, there's another wonderful home owned by the Pickering family in Portsmouth, right on the water. And they are, I'm sure that the lines cross, but it's very early documentation from the onset of these families arriving here, is that there were separate families, and they, so this is not that branch. That judge, I believe I'm correct in saying this, is part of the Portsmouth Pickering family, as opposed to the Salem.
Okay, last question. This is from Dan. I'm curious to know if you have thoughts about the origins of John Pickering's love of language. At least that's what it looks like to me. It's one thing to learn languages for purposes of diplomacy, trade, etc., but quite another to delve into etymology and linguistics. Indeed.
I think that's a good question for Otis. I just to tee you up, Otis, if you turn on your microphone. John Pickering, as I was mentioning before, of course, he did have a kind of neoclassical education here in Salem in preparation of going to Harvard, reading Horace and other things. He did write, as Otis mentioned, the first attributable dictionary of American words. Of course, his agenda in writing that dictionary, which was originally a talk he gave at the American American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Cambridge, was to eradicate all those words. He said they were all Americanisms that ought to be gotten rid of.
He was not liberal in terms.
No, and Noah Webster.
English.
Noah Webster wrote a letter back to him saying, "Thank you for finding all these words, but I think you're misguided. We ought to embrace these words." But Pickering was a lawyer by trade, and a lexicographer by inclination and by his passion. Otis, do you want to jump in at all on his interest?
Yeah, I would just add, onto the end of that, it's in looking through his notebooks, you can see he's kind of working out in a very methodical way, these arguments, a lot of like even in the footnotes, knowing where he's citing things, and there's some future discussion in his mind, like if he has to support his what he's putting forward, that he's in a place where he can easily find those types of things. I do think he's just broad in making his connection between the study of language as a component of fellowship and how people interact with one another, regardless of where they're from, what their race is, or what have you. And I think that's what steered it all along. I don't know if there's one attributable thing other than seeing his father not being able to speak, the native languages, or have any kind of have to rely solely on how words are conveyed. And there's always that tricky distinction between translated and interpreted, right? So there's how you say something could be also you're steering the conversation. And I think that's really the root of it there, is that he wants to be accurate, he wants to be concise, and he wants to be truthful. And language can be shifty in those ways. So I think that's really in the rub of it, when he wakes up in the morning thinking, how can I be more accurate? How can I help people to understand one another more clearly? It's only through the avenue of language.
Can I chime in too, actually? One of the things that I've always enjoyed thinking about with John Pickering VI Obviously his father was a huge influence, I think, but also the time period in which he was growing up, born 1777, living here in Salem with his uncle, not with his father, but with his uncle, who had, different interests than Timothy did. But more importantly, Salem was exploding in wealth and trade connections at that time. From basically all through the 1780s and into the 1790s and before the Quasi-War, 1798, you couldn't throw a rock into the harbor and not hit a ship that was coming back from some overseas port. It was just unbelievable, the amount of wealth and information, and there was the cultural connection too with the Marine Society in Salem as well too. And so I think it was not just a commercial interest, for the people in Salem, but there was a bit of an academic interest. And then I think for John Pickering VI, having his father's connection to languages with the natives, all of those things, I think it was just, for John VI, he could probably just walk down to the harbor and start finding and buying books. And we have records of how many book auctions have taken place of John Pickering's collection over the years. And so I really think that for him, it was just this hunger of knowledge and this hunger of information. And obviously languages for him was a way to really kind of carry all of that, I think, forward. So at least that was my kind of impression of it. His father, but also growing up in Salem when, you'd go down to the docks and you could probably hear these different languages, from people who may have been coming from different ports, and the knowledge and the information and the things that were being brought back, I think really helped inspire him as well.
And Tim, I think you wanted to make a comment.
One other comment is that along with the commerce, there was also, I know several of the first members of the Linda, correct me because I'm going to get it wrong, but it's the ministry for the mission for for foreign missions that Old South was involved in, as is the Tabernacle Church, some of the first members, and frankly the whole. Even Dartmouth College, another weird, strange Salem connection to Joseph's story, but this idea that we create schools for taking the young Native American men and bringing them to these schools and teaching them the way of the Westerners and our language and our what have you. And then Tim Pickering, oddly enough, his father, John's father, thinking, no, we've tried this doesn't really work. What we need to do is create vocational schools that really give these people what they need to survive in the world that we're changing right now. But I would go back to that ministry and the whole idea. We've got numerous papers, and I'm pretty sure Otis has probably seen some of these, that they're all the tracts that he's getting from these different ministers. They're on foreign missions in the Sandwich Islands or whatever. Some of the very first, time you see the Western world starting to deal with a new foreign language is the missionaries, as they're going out trying to spread the word. And quite frankly, underneath this virtuous, many of the characteristics that I would define as they're defining characteristics of the Pickering family, they go back to Christian values. And of love and treating, whatever that, if you want to find, if you really want to get to the root, you got to go back to the big book and their love of it and their passion for it. And frankly, they were much more liberal, in a world that had seen Christian ministries really bringing the sword as much as the word, or more so the sword. I would throw that one in as this, and that would go back to, say, John Clark, the Reverend, who is, I think, Tim Pickering's basically closest friend as well as relative. It goes back to the word, logos.
Linda, I want to just say thank you to you for spurring on the collections committee. You really have been a driving force, together with the board and the current Tim Pickering on the board as chair. Thank you to you, Tim. I think you're still on here, and for all the work you guys are doing. This is stewardship, and it's stewardship of the first order. And it's great that the Pickering House is embracing it.
Amen. I agree more. I'm so happy that we've got a team that's motivated and capable and really interested. I mean, when Amanda was was first doing this work, she would come and stand meekly in my doorway and say, "I've got another one. I love this map."
It went more, Linda, you busy? I got something for you. It's really cool.
We'd all get excited and stop doing everything.
Yeah.
Really well. And I thank our audience for hanging in there. I know this has been a long program. You're getting a sense of what we're trying to do here. It takes time and treasure. We could, as Charlie has said, we could use, as many resources as we can, and anything we get today, we can have matched, and we will put it to good use, and eventually it will get out there in the world so people can see it.
Yeah.
So, thank you. I think we're about to wrap up, and I hope we'll see you on March 13th to entertain Professor Sager. So have a good rest of the day.